Hello everyone, welcome back to another video in the 12 Days of Deltarune. Today I'm going to be ranking all of the theories that I've put out on my channel leading up to chapters 3 and 4. So this should be exciting. Specifically, these are the theories that I've come up with myself, at least to my knowledge, and not just theories that I'm essentially reporting on and giving my own take on from the community. So, for example, I talked about like every night theory, but those aren't all on here because basically none of those were entirely like my conception, obviously. Although certain elements of them might be here because they're not something I've heard other people talk about before. So, this list is ordered in terms of most grounded to most insane. And I'm going to be ranking them on where I think they're going to land from most likely to least likely. So it might be a little bit obvious what direction we're going on as things happen. But hey, we're going to start with Darkner Origins. So this is my first video about Deltarune theories. It was essentially trying to go over every Darkner and finding out exactly what their origin point was. As well as what that might mean for what a Darkner is, like how their history is informed, why certain Darkners don't seem to fit the mold, specifically like Top Chef, for example, which is a spinning top, but also a chef who's actually a baker. Very confusing. Anyway, I think I had some pretty good ideas in here. My favorite part is the connotations theory part, which I talk about in like a lot of videos. Which is essentially just that Darkners aren't based off of their object literally, but off of the connotations that their object gives off. So, for example, if you were to make the rules card in a card game into a Darkner, you might think like, okay, this is going to be somebody who's very strict on the rules, like a hall monitor kind of thing. But that's not really what rules is, right? Rules is goofy and makes puzzles that don't really amount to much and is overly wordy. And those are the connotations associated with a rules card, that like it's kind of useless, like you don't actually use it in a card game. It has no special powers, even though it's very flashy looking, and it's very wordy, despite explaining fairly simple concepts, right? So yeah, that's my favorite part of the theory, and I really do think it's absolutely true. So no notes. Good job, me. Berdly's mom is the drunk bird from Undertale. Alright. This originally had a little extra section to it, but it kind of got debunked over time, which was the library lizard, which I thought was just called that by fans, but was in fact actually called that in the game files, was Berdly's other parent. But that doesn't really work out. However, we only have one other bird NPC in Undertale, and it's this bird that's in Grilby's diner, who's heavily implied to be drunk. I don't think it's literal, but it's heavily implied. And that would kind of go together with a lot of Berdly's issues, which is essentially, you know, trying to be noticed, constantly seeking attention, right? Because, you know, his mother isn't very attentive. Perhaps that makes sense. And also, it kind of explains Queen's alcoholism, because again, if you believe in the connotations theory, Queen is basically supposed to represent everybody's mother, right? And a lot of people attribute Queen's alcoholism to Toriel because of like dialogue from the unreleased Undertale alarm clock. But I feel like her circumstances are so different in Deltarune, I'm not sure that's necessarily like reliable information. So I think this is an alternate theory that makes a lot of sense as well. Honestly, I feel really strongly about this one too, but it's A tier because it's not, it could be that Berdly just has two completely original characters as parents just as well. But I do like this, even if we never meet Berdly's parents. This would be a kind of a fun headcanon anyway. Chris and Susie fell into the bunker. All right, we're starting to get into some more speculative territory here. So the idea behind this theory is that in that original cutscene where Chris and Susie seem to like fall into the dark world in chapter 1, they actually were falling from the closet into the bunker And the bunker runs all underneath the town, like it's a series of tunnels, because, you know, it needs to be an escape route for people to go to the actual bunker, right? So there's little hatches all over town in important buildings. Like, for example, the library or the school or the church, places people would be where you'd want them to file into the bunker, you know? And Chris and Susie fell into one of these access tunnels, which is why they've ended up in this area with all these pillars that kind of look like broken floorboards, right? And the idea would be, because the floorboards look like they're broken upwards instead of downwards, that they actually didn't like break the floor necessarily. The floor kind of broke from the bottom, like from the bunker side instead of the closet side. It wasn't like their weight that broke the floorboards. It's something that's happening in the bunker, or something to do with darkness, perhaps. I do really like the bones of this theory, and really there isn't that much I would change about it overall. I think it's very logical, even if it's not as well-founded. I mean, the only real evidence is that we have a building called the bunker, and that there are these pillars that kind of look like floorboards. So I'd put it in a B tier, probably. I'm not trying to go in order. I didn't plan this, but that feels about right. It could go either way, you know what I mean? This could all be intentional foreshadowing, or this could all be nothing that I've put together, you know? Chapter 3 is about relationships. This comes from my Chapter 3 predictions video. Now, to be clear, it's not just like relationships in general, but it's about kind of coercive relationships, I guess is the best way to put it. Because my idea for Tenna, who I suppose we know more concretely is the main boss of Chapter 3, is that Tenna is some kind of bigwig Hollywood guy. And essentially, instead of, you know, getting people to work for him through force or like, I guess, capitalism, is that how the queen gets people to work for her? Greed? I'm not really sure. In Chapter 3, it's through contracts, right? Like, all the Darkeners have to follow their stage directions because they're signed contracts with Tenna. And as to kind of expound on that, in the same way Chapter 2 talks about how Queen is so controlling, and it kind of expounds into Noelle's relationship with her mother, Chapter 3 would be about these like contractual obligational relationships, and it would kind of expound to talk about the way Toriel felt about Asgore, and then also the way that Chris kind of feels like about Toriel, where everything feels kind of like they have to do it, you know what I mean? Not necessarily that they want to. The relationship is more built on keeping up appearances with each other, not necessarily with the town, than it is like a deep connection, you know? And part of that might just be because, you know, Toriel, in a way, not the same way as in Undertale, lost her husband and then also lost Asriel right after, pretty much, right? Because Asriel went off to college. So her clinging on to Chris more tightly kind of makes sense, and it might be something she's doing like unconsciously. So I think that's basically going to be what this chapter is about, with maybe a little section about Chris and Susie, and maybe Susie coming to doubt whether or not Chris actually sees her as a friend or is just going along with it to stop being bullied. That was something I thought about when I was making this list, and I was like, oh yeah, that could make sense too. So yeah, I mean, I feel like this one's fairly likely. It's kind of a vague concept, so the idea of it being true isn't that surprising, you know? Twin apocalypses. Okay, this one actually I think is very strong, even though I feel like the video isn't quite as good as I could have done for it, but, you know, I didn't explain it that well, basically, is what I'm saying. The idea is that because in the prophecy, Ralsei says there's been an upset in the balance of light and dark, it implies that if there was an upset in the opposite direction, like too much light, not enough dark, there would also be consequences that would be bad for everybody. So far, Ralsei's only really been concerned with telling us about what happens when there's too much darkness, right? He's not so focused on telling us what happens if there's not enough darkness. And the idea is there's essentially two different apocalyptic endings. One, where the roaring happens, where there's too much darkness, and then you have to fight the giants, which could be like, I don't know, the whole town manifested as a darkner or something. Whereas if there's too much light, then you end up with the Angel's Heaven, which is something that Ralsei is actively trying to push us towards for some reason. I won't speculate on that as part of this theory specifically. But the idea is there's two different apocalypses based on which direction you take. Either maybe in the weird route, you end up with the roaring, and then in the normal route, you end up with the Angel's Heaven. Something like that. I feel like this is extremely likely. Sneaking song theory. Okay, this one's kind of funny. It's very simple, too. So there was this cut song that we were given in one of the newsletters for a segment that, the sneaking segment in Chapter 3 that Toby cut out of the game because it was boring. But the song, actually, you know what? I'll just pause the video and I'll put it on in the background right now. Okay, here it is. This is the song. Actually, it takes kind of a little while to get to where it's going, but I guess I'll just keep talking in the meantime. So we got this cut song from a cut segment in Chapter 3 in one of the newsletters, and it has led me to believe that perhaps the person who's coming to answer Toriel's phone call to the police isn't actually Undyne or Napstablook. Is this it? Da, 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 da. I think so, right? Yeah, because this is Lost Girl. Okay, so this is the song. It's playing right now. And very quickly into the song, we're going to hear a familiar motif. It's in like maybe 10 seconds from now. Right here. Da, 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 da. So this motif is the Lost Girl theme, which we've had confirmed by Toby, I believe in one of the anniversary streams, isn't necessarily Noelle's theme exactly. It's more so a more general theme, which makes sense because, I mean, Noelle already has a theme. It's called Girl Next Door. And then we got, during the sweepstakes, a rendition of Lost Girl on a red guitar called Find Her. So it very much seems like Lost Girl is actually associated with Des. So why, then, is this sneaking song theory featuring... This is my sprite for the mayor, by the way. Mayor Holiday. Well, because perhaps Lost Girl just embodies the search for Des, or the sort of underlying sadness of her being missing. So then it could be used for anybody in the Holiday family, right? And it makes a lot more sense if the person who was going to appear during this cut segment that you were going to have to sneak from isn't Noelle, because why would Noelle be here, but is instead the mayor, because we know that the mayor is basically handling a lot of the jobs of the police already. So her actually answering Toriel's phone call instead of Undyne or Napstablook makes just as much sense as anything else, I would say. Plus, then it would set her up for a potentially larger role later, right? I like it. And also it gives you the chance to compare and contrast her and Toriel as mothers. It all kind of works out. I really think this one might be true. And I think it'd be cool if it was. Alright, I had to go back and change the music back. Trust me, there are theories that I don't think are true on here, okay? We just, like I said, we're going with the most accurate first to the most crazy. Chapter 4 equals music. Now, I haven't actually recorded the video for this theory yet because it's part of one of the other videos in the 12 Days of Deltarune. Chapter 4 equals music is basically looking over all the images we have so far for Chapter 4. It's possible that the overall theme, kind of like Chapter 1's was board games, Chapter 2's is computer games, Chapter 3 is the TV shows, could be music. Because taking those 3 other themes that we know so far and then throwing religion on it, I mean, it does work in the sense that they're all methods of escapism, but it feels so out of place compared to the other 3. And it would make sense if Chapter 3 was something out of place, because Chapter 3 already kind of feels out of place in a lot of ways. Toby's confirmed it's not like a huge story chapter, and it's mostly full of mini games. And Chris made the fountain, and personally, I don't think Chris is the knight. So it makes me think that something like different is happening in Chapter 3 than the same pattern we've observed in Chapter 1 and 2. But that's not the case with these themes. It really seems like they're all creative outlets, right? Which, I mean, that makes sense for Toby. And that way you can have the chapter set in the church still, but the theme isn't strictly religion in the same way that like Chapter 1's theme wasn't strictly like cards. It's like a bunch of separate influences that kind of come together to be an overall theme of music, but also you get some of those religious sort of connotations in there as well. Reasoning for thinking that way, besides the random picture you see here of the weird Darkner we saw from the release trailer, or release date trailer, I guess, with the treble clef and the whole note that kind of looks similar. We have a little solo cup guy that's called a marching cup. I think it's called marching something in one of the newsletters. Anyway, it kind of looks like it could be like a little nutcracker maybe, which was my original thought. But if we're going with music, it could be like a marching band, actually. We know there's going to be some sort of important chair, probably more likely in the church than in the Dreamer house. Just this chair in particular is more likely in the church than the Dreamer house. Obviously, there's Chariel, who is an important chair in the Dreamer house. Entirely separate point. Anyway, musical chairs. It's something. What was the other big one? Because I don't have the image in front of me right now for the video. Oh, all the Christmas theming. We got all this random Christmas theming in the newsletters for Chapter 4. And obviously that can make sense with religion, right? But the hometown religion isn't Christianity. So it feels a little weird, right? However, Christmas caroling and Christmas music are very important parts of the holiday. So that could also tie it in together with everything. So yeah, Chapter 4 equals music. This one's like possible. It feels kind of the same as this one to me, where it could go either way. Oh great, we're in the robot section of the OST, where it's those 3 robots playing the same song forever. Sorry. Chair theory. I think my chair theory is basically debunked at this point. Get it? Debunked? My original chair theory was that by matching this chair up to chairs in other places in the game we've seen so far, it looks a lot like it's from the town hall. Which, you know, it's not a terrible idea. The town hall is probably going to be important. It has double doors. We know the mayor is probably important because we've heard a lot about her despite not seeing her. However, I have a feeling it's going to be the church now because we've got so much emphasis in the sweepstakes with Image Friend, who's kind of seems to be revealed by clicking this chair enough. The darker than dark thing seems like it could play into Chapter 4. So it really feels like this might be in the church. So that theory would be categorically incorrect. Oops. Who could have known? Anyway. Gerson was a boss monster. So I talked about this at the beginning of the video. This is one of my mini theories that I have attached to Alvin Knight theory, which is like, why is Alvin trying to make dark fountains, right? Because I assume that the Knight's motive isn't as straightforward as just wanting to destroy the world, because this is a Toby Fox game. In that case, what is Alvin's motive if Alvin were to be the Knight? Well, what if, for example, he's trying to revive Gerson? Now, that isn't an original thought, Plenty of people have thought about that. However, the specific reasoning I put forward, I don't think I've heard from people before, which is that Alvin feels directly responsible for Gerson's death because Gerson was a boss monster. And if you don't know what that means, in Undertale we get the concept explained to us relating to Asgore and Toriel, which we don't really know if it can apply to another monster or not. But let's just say it does, all right? A boss monster can only age so long as they have a child that is living. So in that case, because in Undertale, Asriel is dead, Toriel and Asgore have stayed the same age for a very long time. So in the sense, that would kind of explain perhaps why Gerson's still alive, despite being in Undertale alive to see the same war that Asgore saw with the humans. And like, you could just chalk it up to he's a turtle, he lives a long time, which is fair, completely. But maybe he's also a boss monster, and that's why he's lived for so long. Because when he got older, one of his kids died tragically. I guess specifically because, you know, Deltarune seems to be like an anagram in more ways than one of Undertale. I guess Alvin died tragically in the Undertale universe. And it kind of makes sense, because obviously Gerson wouldn't have a kid in the Undertale universe, because you think Gerson would have trained that kid to be a soldier instead of Undyne, who was just kind of a spunky teenager. You know, it could go either way. But I do like the idea, and it's kind of fun, because all these things Alvin's talking about how the family still gets condolences from people all over the world that Gerson's dead. Every time one of those letters comes in, Alvin gets that pang of guilt that, like, if I wasn't around, my dad would still be alive for all these other people, right? I have to fix this somehow. And I think, you know, it kind of ties into the overall themes of Deltarune, that Alvin still hasn't dealt with the traumas in his life and is still running away from them by trying to, you know, fix everything somehow. So yeah, I think C tier probably makes most sense. It's not likely, but it's kind of a fun wrinkle to think about anyway. Like, this might be something that's not even confirmed in the game anyway. It would be, like, hinted at in, like, some letters or something. You know, it'd be one of those don't forget type scenarios from Undertale, where we continue to speculate about it for a very long time. Sunlight defeats Dark Worlds. Okay. This one also came from the Closet video, which I think, you know, looking back, might be one of my best videos, theory videos. There's a lot of juicy stuff in there. Anyway, Sunlight defeats Dark Worlds is basically the idea that the reason Ralsei has this line, or actually no, it's Sham who has this line, where they say that you shouldn't stay in the Dark World after the sun goes down, which is like an ominous line, kind of reminiscent of history a little bit. However, what if it was literal? What if you just, like, can't get out of the Dark World at nighttime? What if you need some sort of light in order to be able to escape the Dark World? Otherwise, the exits just lock up. And the major point of evidence that I had for this theory is that the warp from Castletown doesn't exist. Well, you can't get to the room, so that's one reason. But it doesn't exist when you first go through Castletown, but it does later, and it manifests as like a sparkly beam of light. So perhaps, because we get shut in the closet in Chapter 1, the knight specifically, if the knight was the one who shoved us in the closet, that's kind of an assumption. Whoever shoved us in the closet and closed the door and wouldn't let us get out was covering the door specifically so that that light ray couldn't shine through and they couldn't escape as easily as they would have been able to otherwise, Chris and Susie. And then after that, because that person is no longer there blocking it, the light ray can go through the little cracks in the door to the closet, and therefore we have our little warp out of the Castletown. I think this is possible, especially if the whole town is eventually going to become a dark world. Surviving till daylight seems like it'd be a good ticking clock. I think this is another B tier one. Shamalovania. So this is the idea that I went over everybody in Deltarune and tried to pick out people who would make sense to have Megalovania as their song if Deltarune was going to have a rendition of Megalovania, which I'm sure it will. And there's obviously a couple characters it would kind of make sense for. Maybe Noelle in the Snowgrave route. Maybe Susie. And at some point, or Gaster, or the Vessel. But the problem with all of those, except I guess the Vessel, but you know, the problem with all of those is that they kind of already have their own themes. Like Susie has her own battle theme already. Gaster has his own theme, and that's not to say you can't combine Megalovania with somebody else's theme to make like a new rendition of it. But generally, it is straight up Megalovania, right? Like, there's no Sans flair to Megalovania in Undertale, and there's no Homestuck flair. Well, there is Homestuck flair, but there's no specific Homestuck character flair in the Megalovania rendition in Homestuck, really. And then if you grab all the traits of the characters that are usually canonically associated with Megalovania, which I know is a little controversial to say, perhaps, because there's lots of speculation about whose theme is Megalovania actually in Undertale and also in Homestuck. But generally, the idea is they are the least likely person to have to save the world. You know, there's somebody who you would never think would be able to stand up to the big bad villain. So, Sans in Undertale is pretty obvious. The character in Homestuck I'm referring to is Aradia, who is already dead at the start of the story and manifests as a ghost, and then a ghost inside a robot, and then comes back to life during the segment where she stops the main villain while Megalovania plays. So Sham kind of fills those archetypes the best out of anybody in Deltarune. Sham is a character with a lot of cynicism. It's also the same as Sans and Aradia. A character who in no way you would expect to be the only person left to stand up to the big bad, but at the same time has enough knowledge to be the only one to stand up to the big bad. So I feel like this one's... I'll put it in B tier. That feels right. It's solid, but like there's no actual evidence for it, you know? It's all just relying on not coincidence, but speculation, I guess. It's following patterns that may or may not be real, is basically what I'm saying. Narnia theory. Okay, so this is a very, I could have made this its own video, but I kind of just threw it in with the Mayor Knight theory in my Holiday Nights video. And the idea is essentially that Deltarune is parodying some aspects of Narnia, and therefore, the mayor has taken over Asgore's position. Asgore was the king. In Narnia, similarly, the true king of Narnia is ousted by this ice witch, right? There's a lot of other connections. Ralse is a goat man who you meet after going through a closet into another world, wearing a red scarf, which is exactly the same as Mr. Tumnus from Narnia. And also one of the children joining with a evil queen is also part of Narnia, and that kind of describes Birdley's relationship with Queen in Chapter 2. Also, petrification is a thing in Narnia as well. The Ice Witch, I don't remember her name. I should probably have looked that up, but I guess it's not really important. Anyway, the Ice Witch turns Mr. Tumnus specifically to stone at a certain point, as well as a bunch of other characters. There's like a whole room full of statue people, and they all come back to life once the true king is put back into power. So there's a lot of connections there. Another facet of Narnia, which probably won't be in Deltarune, but it could, is the idea that, well, actually, this is technically true. Time moves differently in Narnia than it does in our world. So going and having a big adventure in Narnia and then coming back to our world, barely any time has passed. And that's also true in Deltarune, where time moves differently, not exactly the same way, though. So there's a lot of like tangential connections to Narnia, and they must be intentional at this point, right? You'd think. So I'm going to put it... I think the idea that they are actually intentional allusions is probably true to Narnia. I think the idea that we actually have to defeat Mayor Holiday as the knight and Asgore has to return to power maybe is a little bit dodgy So that feels like a decent spot somewhere between here. Shadows on the wall. So shadows on the wall is a kind of complicated theory. This is another good one, by the way. I like this one a lot. The idea is essentially that there's this concept in philosophy from literally Plato, yes, called the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is fairly simple. You have a man, you tie him up in a cave for his entire life. He's facing the wall of the cave and has never seen the outside. So to him, the sounds that he hears and his idea, his understanding of the world around him is based on the shadows he sees on the wall. So if like a dog passes by the entrance to the cave and the dog's shadow goes up on the wall, to the man in the cave, that shadow is a dog. Like, the man has no concept of what a 3D furry dog is. All that the man knows is that the shadow makes the sounds happen at the same time as the shadow. It's all connected to him. So how this connects to Deltarune might seem a little strange. However, you could make the argument that a very similar thing is happening with the Darkners. Darkners are an object who we are seeing the quote-unquote shadow of, which is their connotations. Sort of the things that surround them, but not their actual true object. In the Dark World, we don't actually see, for example, the rules card, and then rules card is also there, right? We just see rules card, who is the concepts behind a rules card, and that's what we see as the Darkner. And there's a lot more kind of to it that you'd have to watch the full video to kind of get. But the main idea is that if this is the way the Dark Worlds work, and you have to kind of expect Darkners to kind of turn out as the things behind the true form of a thing, not their actual true form, then if Alvin was the knight, for example, just bringing it back, Alvin would be unable to create Gerson because he could only create Darkners that have the same connotations as Gerson, you know? Like, if he actually dug up Gerson's hammer from the grave and used it to try to create a Darkner, there would be hammer connotations baked in and a bunch of stuff other people feel about Gerson, not just, you know, a replicant of Gerson as a Darkner. And then following along with that, how would you eventually create a true, like, person out of the darkness, right? How would you get back to true meaning? Well, okay, what if we flip the allegory of the cave on its head? And now, instead of the shadows being cast by light, we douse the light completely. In that case, there are no shadows. There is no anything. The man can see nothing, okay? Everything is just darkness. And at that point, everything in the man's mind becomes reality to him. So, in that case, if the Darkners are the shadows, and now we destroyed that sort of layer, and we've gone even deeper, then the new shadows, quote-unquote, the new Darkners, whatever they would actually be, in this darker-than-dark scenario, quite literally in this allegory, they would be based entirely on people's thoughts and ideas, rather than a physical object casting people's ideas. So in that case, you actually could bring Gerson back, because you would just have to have your memories of Gerson kind of coalesce into a being. And the main theory is that that's what Gaster's trying to do. Gaster is trying to get us to a point where we can create a world with this dark enough darkness that Gaster can be reformed from all the fragmented memories people have about him, including the player's memories of Gaster. After all, Gaster keeps complimenting us for, you know, digging deep into the lore of the games and all this, because he needs us to. He needs us to know more about him in order to come back to life, essentially. In other words, Deltarune is Gaster's experiment trying to get us as players to help him reform a physical form after being shattered across time and space. It is crazy. It's basically the connotations theory, but a bunch of extra stuff on top. And as much as I think it's a very compelling theory, I have to put it in C tier. The odds of it actually being true are just like not that high. They're just not. But I still think the video is a good watch. I mean, in the off case that Toby and I actually had the same wavelength for a short amount of time. Okay, Ralsei's Chris. This was brought up very briefly at the end of one of my Determination and Deltarune videos. Which the premise of that video is essentially, in Chapter 3, Chris creates a dark fountain without having their soul in their body, because we're still shoved in the couch cushions. How? Right? Because Queen implies that you need a high level of determination in order to create a dark fountain. But without the soul, Chris shouldn't have had any determination, right? If the rules work the same way we think they did in Undertale, which was never confirmed, by the way. So it's very messy. But anyway, this sort of theory came out at the end of that video, which is that if Chris without a soul... Is Chris without a soul a Darkener or a Lightener? Because if the red soul doesn't actually belong to Chris, and Chris is like borrowing our soul, let's say, then doesn't that make Chris kind of like a Darkener in a lot of ways? Because that's kind of what Darkeners are in the dark world. They are beings without a soul. Because it doesn't specifically have to be a human soul or a monster soul anymore, right? It's just beings with a soul. That light inside your soul that's still shining in the cold is the thing that allows you to go into the dark world and not become a Darkener. So is it possible that because Chris has this red soul, that the Chris inside the dark worlds is in some way our connotations of Chris? So the way we see Chris is sort of manifested in the dark world. And that Chris, as an actual person, it doesn't have the red soul normally, manifests as a Darkener, which is how people in the world see Chris. And that's Ralsei. That's the theory, is that the reason Ralsei can come with us and has all these special properties and is always there when we're there is because Ralsei is formed from Chris's soulless body, whereas Chris, the Lightener in the dark world, is formed from the red soul and our ideas about Chris. The only problem with this is obviously, like, do the memories transfer over? I guess, right? It would have to be that way. Because Chris surely learns how to create a dark fountain, unless Chris is the knight, surely learns how to create a dark fountain from Queen in Chapter 2, and then does it in Chapter 3. So the memories would have to carry over. And also, it's just blatantly insane. So, I mean, I have to put it in... Well, okay, it's not deconfirmed, so I'll put it in C tier, but it's so crazy. And yet, there's just so much about it that I like. Because we all kind of, I think, can see the things that make Ralsei feel like Chris's ideal form. I've seen a lot of people bring that up. The idea that Ralsei is what Chris wish they could be, but are not. So, like, you know, a monster with the red horns that relate to the red headband, and super nice, and everybody likes them, and, you know, all that stuff. More like Asriel. Maybe even able to heal people is part of it, because, like, you know, might have seen what happened to Des. However, I like the added little twists that it's literally everybody's connotations about Chris. Like, it's not even Chris's ideal form. This is just how people see Chris. Chris is like a little mini Asriel, and they remember the red horn headband, so Ralsei has the little pink horns. And, oh, they must be so nice and soft and polite and all this stuff because they're related to the Dreamers. When in reality, Chris just wants to be taken seriously desperately. And that's why they kind of have a fraught relationship. If you believe something like T-theory, for example. Anyway, I'm glad I remembered that theory because it was literally the last one I thought about before making this video. And I think it's very fun, even though it's very unlikely. And then finally, purple guy. So you might not see, like, what? What? Purple guy? Purple guy! Yes. The idea behind this is, in the same video, I looked at Birdley's mom potentially being the bird from Undertale. I looked at Purple Guy, who's one of the few original characters in Deltarune we've had so far. In Hometown. Like, that isn't like one of the school children or like somebody who needed to be created. Noelle's parents, for example. Purple Guy ostensibly is just there for a meme, right? Oh yeah, it's Purple Guy who works at the pizza restaurant. Haha, very funny. Five Nights at Freddy's. But the theory is essentially that nobody knows who Purple Guy is. Like, nobody has any idea who's in this costume. So what if the person that's in this costume is actually a big twist, and the meme is actually there to protect that twist for the future? So, for example, if you believe that Azrael is the knight, right? Perhaps Azrael is in this costume. And then if people searched up who is the knight in Deltarune, they would get the answer Purple Guy. And they'd be like, okay, that's like clearly not true. That's a joke. And then maybe they'd, just move on to something else without ever actually realizing that, in fact, the knight is Azrael or whoever's in the Purple Guy suit, right? I mean, it's so impossible. But the idea that Toby is hiding a twist behind a meme, it's possible. So yeah, that's my ranking. You can also take this ranking if you'd like and let me know what you think, I guess, by posting it on Tiermaker. I'll leave a link in the description. I think I did an okay job. Look at this. It's actually perfectly balanced, as all things should be. I did not mean to do that, but hey, there we go. I think I did a pretty good job coming up with creative theories for this leg of the Deltarune saga. I hope you guys agree. And once Chapter 3 and 4 actually come out, which they haven't yet at the time of recording this video, obviously, there's going to be a lot more things to theorize about. Now, I consider myself kind of a tertiary Deltarune theorist. I am not going to come up with your main most likely theory, probably. So it'll take me probably a couple months of watching other people's theories and having like a groundwork to be like, okay, now I understand everything that was kind of thematically going on in Chapter 3 and 4. I feel like I have a strong foundation to build on, and then I can do crazy stuff like Ralsei's Chris. Maybe we'll do a video at some point. Well, okay, part of my playthrough is going to be a bingo sheet of Deltarune theories and trying to see which ones are deconfirmed, if any, and which ones are confirmed, if any. So perhaps I can do a post-mortem on my Deltarune Chapter 3 and 4 theories after the chapters come out, if you guys would be interested in that, to see how many have survived, how many have gotten stronger, and how many have gotten weaker, using the same tier list. Wow! Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. This is probably a long video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the 12 Days of Deltarune. Okay, bye!